much indeed for your kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come to speak to you today. What I'd like to do in about 20 or so minutes is go through some of the research that is out there that might help us understand better the type of contribution that new technologies, digital technologies, but in particular mobile technologies can make on the one hand to student learning outcomes and on the other to teacher effectiveness and teacher professional development, as seems to be the core theme of your conference. And in order to start off, I thought I'll remind us of one of the key challenges that we tend to face as educators around the world, and we've seen some interesting examples of that in the many pictures that my colleagues have presented to you so far, and that is that in traditional schooling practices, there's an excessive amount of decontextualized information, indirect and abstract knowledge, and second-hand experience. And basically, what I think we ought to do is try and look to technology to help us address this particular challenge. It would also probably be quite helpful for us to think about what we mean by good teaching and teacher effectiveness in order to be able to come to some view, whatever that might be, about the potential contribution of mobile technologies and digital technologies. And what I've brought along here is all but one particular definition by Mary Kalantzis and Bill Cope from the United States. They think that teacher effectiveness can be characterized by an ability to foster effective learning by engaging the learner's identity and creating a sense of belonging, whilst at the same time taking the learner on a journey of discovery and transformation, but within the realms of intelligibility and safety. So it's a very particular type of definition of effective learning that I'm putting to you this morning, not necessarily one that has at its focus league tables and performativity, but a rather broader perspective on learning. And it's been very interesting to listen to the previous two speakers to see how that sort of perspective on learning seems to be underpinning their efforts as well. So I think it's in this context that we need to look to technology and its potential contribution. We can, of course, also look to the educational sciences and to psychology in particular to help us understand a little bit better what important conditions for learning are. And my argument this morning to you is that it is only once we understand these conditions that we can start to think very, very effectively about the use of technology and the contribution of technology. And I've just introducing here some work by a colleague from the Netherlands, Paul Kirschner, who sets out 4 conditions for learning. And as you look through this list, and I've just highlighted some of the key terms on the slide: interaction with others, interaction with oneself, confrontation between internal and external dialogue, an interaction between individuals and others with the learning, training, and social environment in which learning and instruction is taking place. If one thinks about those, then I think we can all start to think very quickly about ways in which digital technologies, mobile technologies, can start to make a real contribution. But the research would also allow us to gain useful insights into the notion of effective teachers. And there's many, many lists, and many countries, including the United Kingdom, has got what it's called standards for teachers. And I didn't want to bring along any sort of national standards, but I wanted to bring along a list of characteristics that researchers in the United States had put together to help us maybe again understand the sorts of characteristics that we should be looking for in teachers, and the argument being here that again it's not technology per se that's going to make the difference, but it's the way it is being used, how it is being used by teachers that is important. So therefore we need to look at the extent to which, for example, technology can help us support teachers in setting high expectations for their students, in contributing to a positive academic attitudinal environment and social outcomes, and so forth. I haven't got the time to go through this list in detail. I just wanted to make a general point, and I think it's quite interesting to see how the speakers before me have already shown some interesting examples here. And then, of course, I think it's useful to look at, well, what do we know about pedagogy? What do we know already about effective pedagogy? And in this particular slide, I'm sharing with you some work from Australia, Queensland to be precise, where under the banner of productive pedagogy, they've carried out a longitudinal study in the early 2000s, which came up with these sorts of characteristics. And what they did was they went into a large number of classrooms, video recorded these classrooms, and from those video recordings came to an understanding of what the characteristics of effective pedagogies were. And those weren't classrooms that used technology specifically. Some may, but many I suspect won't have. But if we're saying that from research we know these are characteristics of effective pedagogy, we can then start to ask ourselves, how can we best use technology in order to support these sorts of characteristics along enhancing the intellectual quality of conversations and discourses that go on in classrooms, the relevance of that which is taught and which is learned for learners, the conduciveness of the environment in which this takes place, as well as a true recognition of the difference in terms of those characteristics that are set out here inside classrooms. So this is a long list of precepts before we ever get to technology, but since we're meant to be talking about technology, I obviously do want to talk about technology as well this morning. And what I'm trying to do here in my next slide is start to think about, well, what then can technology offer us as teachers and as educators? And this is the sort of list that I've put together for myself. You might have different lists based on your uses of technology, but from where I'm sitting, it looks to me as if what is particularly attractive about digital technologies and mobile technologies in particular are these sorts of characteristics: their multifunctionality, their convergence, the way in which they bring together all sorts of different functions in one device, and how these functions then are linked to a wide range of resources that's available to us on the internet and the World Wide Web, their portability, their ubiquity, their personal ownership. And it's particularly interesting looking around the room how many of you do have portable devices with you and using them in various different ways to capture what's going on here in the room, hopefully with a view to taking that back and reviewing it later on in your own time and so forth. So we haven't got a lot of time this morning, so I won't be able to go through all these characteristics. But as you can see from the length of the list and the various different dimensions, the potential of technology is great. And what I think we need to do is match that potential of technology with our understanding of learning and teacher effectiveness that I've mentioned earlier on in order to get the best possible results. And if we look in terms of mobile devices in particular at some statistics, here's just some statistics I've found from the US, the Pew Research Center, which specializes in those sorts of things. It's very interesting to see how, whereas 54% of Americans seem to think that smartphones are not always needed, it is equally interesting to see that 46% say, well, we couldn't live without them. So what we're seeing here are some quite fundamental and profound changes in which we, in our everyday life worlds, become to rely on digital technologies. And the question for me that increasingly asks itself in this context is, how can we justify not to utilize these resources in our teaching and learning, in our classrooms, in our schools, when they've become so pervasive in the everyday life worlds of our learners and of our teachers. And again, if you look further at this slide, you can see that yes, some people do associate these technologies with more negative attributes, such as 30% think it's a leash, 28% think it's distracting, 7% think they're annoying, 19% think they're a financial burden. Nevertheless, 70% think it offers freedom, 72% think it offers connectivity, and so forth. And what's equally interesting is that if we look at that in terms of age profile, it's not really that important for you to see the chart, but basically the top, the lighter color, is the 18 to 29-year-old segment, the middle color is the 30 to 49-year segment, and the darker blue color is the 50-plus segment. You can see that throughout the age demographic, there isn't all that much difference really in terms of the popularity of mobile devices and mobile services in our society, and it's really only against headings such as video, which is the second from the bottom, and music, which is the last on this list, where there is a little bit of a difference between the younger demographic and the older demographic. So I think in order then for us to really be able to think about how we want to use mobile devices effectively in teaching and learning, we should be looking at how they are being used by young people, and as we could just see in the previous slides, not so young people, in terms of their everyday life worlds. And what people do with and through technology is they use them for processes of identity formation, they use them for social interaction, they use them for making meaning in and of the world, they use them for entertainment, and they increasingly use them for learning in informal contexts. So I think again, this list suggests that they've got some very, very powerful affordances in relation to teaching and learning. However, what we do need to take into account is the fact that these technologies are bound up in quite some significant transformation in which people live, work, learn, and so forth. So they are a characteristic of quite fundamentally changing media habits and social behavior in relation to friendship and interest-driven online activity. So it's a question of learning new behaviors, not just adapting and adopting existing behaviors. Research by colleagues in the United States, here I'm quoting Mimi Ito and her team, through ethnographic studies with young people, has found that actually what is emerging are new genres of participation. So in order to be effective in using social media, you need to develop new skills, what this particular research calls hanging out, messing around, and geeking out. And there's also some very interesting research by a colleague of mine, Charles Crook from the University of Nottingham, for example, which shows that there's quite some disjuncture between the affordances of social media and what school curricula usually ask of us, and in order therefore to integrate social media effectively into school curricula, we need to look very carefully at the learning objectives and the learning processes we operate in schools. And then of course the work by Jim Paul G, for example, again from the United States, shows that new types of approaches to learning are emerging, what he calls passionate affinity-based learning, in which people connect to a shared endeavor, interest, or passion. My own work, and we haven't got time to go into it in detail, but it's the general point I would like to make. My own work suggests that it is really important to understand the broader underlying issues that govern the emergence of mobile devices and mobile learning in order to be able to use it effectively in teaching and learning, the structures that govern them, the cultural practices through which they manifest themselves, as well as, of course, the agency which they afford, on the one hand, to individual learners as well as to teachers, which are quite different to traditional classrooms. And so what we think is important is, on the one hand, to understand the broader picture, how the world is changing, how the world of education is changing, how things like instability, provisionality, individualization, and so forth are becoming increasingly important, and how, in order therefore to prepare young people for a world in flux, we need to look carefully not just at Web 2 and school cultures, not just at pedagogy and learning design, but very importantly also at teacher professional formation, development, and research. And finally, I'd just like to spend a moment or two on the question of who or what is mobile. The topic for my talk, mobile learning, education on the move, is not one that I chose myself. The organizers chose it for me. And so I thought I just wanted to spend a moment or two on really thinking about this notion of mobility. Do we really need that adjective mobile in front of learning? Does it make a significant difference? Does the prefix E, electronic, make a really significant difference to learning? Well, in the case of mobile, the answer to that question for me would be yes. It does make a difference. It makes a difference in terms of the way in which, as I just said, the world around us is in transformation and is increasingly characterized by things like instability and so forth. That's part of this mobile complex. But it also requires of us as learners and us as teachers to develop new dispositions, what I call here a new habitus, which forces us to look at the world differently, and in particular look at the world and look at the resources that we can access with and through those technologies as cultural resources that become very meaningful focal points for what we do in education and in the classroom. So it's a question of using the mobile device to turn the environment in which I am, whatever it may be and wherever it may be, into a site of learning. And I think mobile devices have that potential. And very quickly then, what I would like to do is share with you just a couple of findings from research that show what technologies of the sort that we've been hearing about in the first two presentations can do for us as teachers. And Charles Crook, who I mentioned earlier, and his colleagues carried out some studies in the United Kingdom a few years ago, where they went into 85 classrooms in which technologies were used. So that's different to those classrooms in Australia that I mentioned earlier on. These were meant to be classrooms in which technology was used, video recorded those classrooms, and then abstracted from those classrooms some lessons of what they saw. And ICT, information and communication technologies, according to Crook and their research, makes possible new forms of classroom practice in three aspects in terms of the reconfiguration of space, such that new patterns of mobility, flexible working, and activity management can occur. And we've heard already about active learning and so forth. So there's clearly something there for us to take away. New ways in which class activities can be triggered, orchestrated, and monitored, and new experiences associated with the virtualization of established and routine practices. And their research also finds that ICT creates the possibility of a wide variety of research practices, of learning practices, in particular again around exposition, independent research, and construction of knowledge. So the empirical work that does exist would very much encourage us to continue to look towards technology to help us make a contribution to the overarching theme of your conference and look at it in more detail. But what is a very, very important prerequisite, and that is the point at which I'd like to stop my input this morning, is actually about teacher formation and teacher development, as I've already mentioned. And in the context of the United Kingdom, about 10 years or so ago, the government funded quite a significant study, which was called the Impact 2 study, which tried to empirically prove whether or not technologies can make a measurable difference in terms of learning outcomes. These are not the results I want to focus on here today. What I want to focus on is a report that came out as part of this study, which basically looked very, very carefully at the sorts of skills, the sorts of knowledge, the sorts of dispositions that teachers needed in order to be able to really maximize the inherent potential of technologies. And I just reproduce this list here. It goes over onto 2 pages, and I'm not going to go through this in detail other than to say the demand is great, and if we really want to make a lasting difference through the use of technology, the one area where we cannot economize is the area of teacher education and teacher development, and how our new teachers are prepared to use those technologies throughout their professional lives. Thank you very much indeed.